Hi, how's it going? I recently found some dinosaur short stories that I'm going to talk about today. I'm too lazy to make a proper intro, so we're literally just going to get right into this. Let's go. Forever. For a while after my Just Like Old Times video, I thought the only thing I had left to cover from Robert J. Sawyer was End of an Era, which I still haven't read yet, but as it turns out, Sawyer actually made another dinosaur short story by the name of Forever, which is about a race of intelligent dinosaurs scrambling to prevent their own extinction. Now I know that might sound familiar to Sawyer's Quintaglios from his Quintaglio Ascension trilogy, and there will be some similarities between the two dinosaurs' cultures. But Sawyer does mention in the introduction of his story that the dinosaurs in this one, which are a race called the Shizu, are different from the Quintaglios. So the way everything went down was that back in 1987, Sawyer decided to quit writing short stories because for him, at this point in time, the negatives outweighed the positives when it came to writing them. 5 years later, he was approached by another science fiction author, Mike Resnick, who was working on a sci-fi dinosaur anthology book with Martin Greenberg called Dinosaur Fantastic. And he asked Sawyer if he could write a dinosaur story for them to put in this anthology. That story would be Just Like Old Times, and it was quite successful. So successful that when Resnick and Greenberg came back to write another dinosaur anthology book, this time called Return of the Dinosaurs, they invited Sawyer back yet again to write them another story. That story was called Forever, and it's about the Shizu, an intelligent race of what I'm assuming are tyrannosaurs of some kind, and their attempt to prevent the death of their species. The story revolves around a saurian astronomer by the name of, I kid you not, Cholo. Yes, this dinosaur, with human levels of intelligence, is named Cholo. I fucking love that. Anyways, Cholo is currently in Beskaltech, the capital of the small island chain that he and the rest of his race inhabit. On these islands, it was just them that lived there aside from smaller animals and a few domesticated dinosaurs like the shield horns, which I think are supposed to be ceratopsians of some kind. But far away beyond the vast oceans was the mainland where the wild dinosaurs resided, like the meat scoopers, the shovelbills, the terraclaws, and so on. The Shizu didn't really travel to the mainland very often due to the hostility of these wild dinosaurs that caused less of any voyage to return than they had when they left the island. But sailing wasn't Cholo's job, it was observing the sky, and right now he's trying to discover a new planet. Currently, there are 6 planets that they're able to see with the naked eye that were discovered long ago, which are called Sunhugger, Silver, Red, High, and Slow. The 6th planet was discovered more recently, only about 100 years ago, by another Shizu by the name of Ixor, which is also the planet's name since she named it after herself. Cholo was envious of this accomplishment of discovering a new planet, and Ixor's name being cemented to it, meaning her name will never be forgotten. Cholo was looking to do the same, as he wanted his name to be remembered forever as well. But one night, as he was scoping out the night sky for a possible 7th planet, he did end up finding some kind of unaccounted space object that he initially thought to be a celestial body of some kind. But after spending months observing its movements, Cholo realized this was no planet. It was a meteor, and it was heading straight towards their planet. Cholo brings the dilemma up to Queen Kava, telling her if the meteor were to strike one of their cities, it would mean complete destruction of that city and the many deaths of its residents. Also, in their conversation, they confirmed that the planet they're living on is Earth. For those of you that don't know why I clarified that, it's because in Sawyer's Quintaglio Ascension trilogy, the sapient dinosaurs in those books were living on an Earth-like moon rather than Earth itself. There's a lot to that story and the Quintaglio's origins. I definitely recommend reading the series if you haven't already. Or if you want a more simplified version of it, you could always watch my video on it as well. Sorry to derail the story. Going back to it, the story implies the meteor is not big enough to destroy all of Earth, but it is big enough to cause serious damage to any land it hits. And Cholo also brings up that even if it doesn't hit land and instead hits the ocean, the waves it would cause could destroy their island home. With this information, the queen orders for the Shizu to build walls and embankments around the island so that if the meteor does hit the ocean, the hits from the waves won't be as devastating. Luckily, they had time to do this since Cholo estimated it would be months before the meteor would eventually strike. But as time went on, the meteor became more and more noticeable in the sky. Eventually, it would finally hit Earth, and when it did, the following few days resulted in nothing. To the overall Shizu population, it came off as if Cholo overreacted and caused a panic for no reason. But after a few days, the islands were hit with a very ugly windstorm, followed by violent waves that crashed against the island, confirming the meteor did impact the water. One island's embankments would unfortunately succumb to the intense waves, causing the city and its residents to become swept away. But the other embankments held, and after many days of this, everything became calm again, and the skies began to clear. Despite the chaos, the Shizu were alive, and it was all thanks to Cholo. Queen Kava is so grateful for Cholo's warning that she offers to give him a reward of his choice, he just had to name it. To the queen's surprise, Cholo asks for an expedition to locate the crash site. Hesitant at first, she allows this, but also tells Cholo to think of another reward that would be more long-lasting. And with that, Cholo takes one ship and a crew of Shizu with him out to sea. For the next couple of months, they searched the ocean for the impact site, but they never found it, leading Cholo to believe the ocean had covered up any signs left of it. But he figured if they made it this far out, they might as well continue west towards the mainland despite its many dangers. However, when they eventually reached the continent, they immediately noticed the devastation left behind by the meteor. The shores were covered in ocean debris and dead sea creatures. The meteor had caused a forest fire that burnt down a lot of the vegetation until it reached a river where the fire had stopped. They crossed the river only to discover nothing but the fossilized skull of a shield horn sticking out of the ground and the rotting dead body of a meat scooper. Aside from that, they only saw small birds and mammals. Some more months would go by and Cholo eventually returned to the island, reporting to the queen all that he saw from the trip. From what's being told, the story implies that the wild dinosaurs that once dominated the mainland were beginning to diminish in numbers and soon they will all be gone. What that means for the Shizu, it's not really explained, but continuing the story, Cholo tells the queen that he figured out what he wants his reward to be. The story ends months later, when a statue of Cholo is unveiled to a small crowd of Shizu. While it may not be the planet he had hoped to attach his name to, Cholo was happy that he would be remembered forever. Overall, a very interesting story. My only complaint is that there is not any more information about the Shizu and their history or origins. Given they're from Earth, I'm inclined to believe the Shizu were brought up through more natural means rather than some extraterrestrial interference like the Quintaglios. So it would have been cool to learn a little bit more about their history, but that's to be expected from a short story. So it's more of a minor complaint than anything. Overall, it's a neat little story about a dinosaur who wants to preserve his name in history. In the beginning, it came off as almost selfish, like his only purpose for his work was for the prestige of having his name known, but as the story progressed, you sensed less and less of that, especially when he was offered a reward for the first time around, and decided on an expedition to learn more about the meteor rather than anything that had to do with him specifically. But of course, at the end, he got his statue, but by that point, it felt earned. Not to the vanity of Cholo, but more for the preservation of history. But that's just my personal take from it. The Greatest Dying. Earlier, I had mentioned Dinosaur Fantastic, the sci-fi dinosaur anthology by Mike Resnick and Martin Greenberg, which contains all sorts of very interesting and unique dinosaur stories made by various different sci-fi authors, one of which is called The Greatest Dying. I've only read a handful of stories from this book, but of the ones I have gone through, I think The Greatest Dying is one of my favorites so far. The story was written by Frank M. Robinson, a well-known science fiction author, who was invited by Resnick and Greenberg to contribute a story in their newest dinosaur anthology. What he wrote was a story about a theory in how the dinosaurs went extinct. The story begins with scientist Reed Locke, who's in a museum lab examining a piece of amber containing what could quite possibly be the most important discovery in the world. Within the piece of amber is a 2-inch dinosaur claw with a piece of dinosaur flesh skewered at the tip. making it the oldest and best preserved piece of actual dinosaur flesh in history. The amber piece had been found in the mountains of Peru, which used to be more forested back in the late Cretaceous period between 65 to 70 million years ago, at least according to the reports that were given to them alongside the material. Locke guesses what the scenario that led to the claw getting stuck in amber might have been like. He imagines a small carnivorous dinosaur who had hunted and killed its prey, but there might have been some struggle in the process, leading to its claw being loosened. After eating its prey, the theropod might have noticed the small leftover flesh stuck to its claw, and to remove it, the theropod dinosaur might have scraped it against a tree to which its loosened claw might have gotten stuck on. And sometime later, some tree sap dripped onto the claw and piece of flesh, confining it within a golden-orange tomb for millions of years. Despite its importance, Locke opts to not tell his colleagues Harry Austin and Julius Pachelk about the find, as they are currently busy upstairs running the museum's exhibit. Austin's in charge of the museum's bone room and research lab, and he's more loose around his profession while still maintaining a brilliant mind for his field. Pachelk, on the other hand, was a bit more cleanly dressed and more professional, as he was the head of the museum and also served as its spokesperson. The two were running the museum's newest exhibit, which featured several dioramas of life-size prehistoric animals. While Austin was helping out a photographer, Pachelk was talking with a reporter, who was asking several questions about dinosaurs, including how they went extinct. Pachelk explains that the more popular theory is that a meteor had wiped out the dinosaurs during an event that's given the name the Great Dying. The reporter writes down some notes and asks more questions regarding the dinosaurs' extinction before Austin appears, who had overheard their entire conversation while working with the photographer. The reporter then asks Austin his input on the theory of dinosaurs being wiped out by a meteor, to which Austin says he doesn't fully agree with. Instead, he sees merit with the disease theory. When the seas began to drain away and land masses began to rise, so would land bridges that would begin to connect the continents together, leading to prehistoric animals from different regions mixing and interacting with each other. But this could have led to many issues, namely the fact that animals in a certain area carry diseases that they grew an immunity to. But when the land bridge opened to them, they carried these diseases to new areas and spread them to animals that didn't have the same kind of immunity to them, quickly leading to a mass illness and causing the deaths of several species. And the animals from both ends suffered, as dinosaurs from America had their own set of diseases that they spread to the inhabitants of Asia, and dinosaurs from Asia spread their own set of diseases to the ones in America. Soon, a plague would end up wiping out most of life on Earth, and Austin even says that there was some truth to the meteor theory, as it likely did possibly hit Earth after the spread of the plague, wiping out the rest of dinosaurian life. As Austin continues his conversation with the reporter, Locke is downstairs, still examining the amber piece. Realizing the worth of a find like this and wanting to gain credit for it, Locke decided to try and take the claw and flesh out of the piece of amber with a dental drill, so that he can place it in a proper preservative, but when he's finally able to get the claw and flesh free from the amber, he accidentally drops the specimen on the ground. When he went to go pick up the claw with the piece of flesh still skewered onto it, it had pierced through the skin of his palm deep enough to cause it to bleed. Locke had wrapped it with a cloth, hid the claw and flesh, and cleaned up the evidence before making his way downstairs, where Austin and Pachelk had just finished chatting with the reporter. They notice the bloody cloth around Locke's hand, and Austin goes to take a look at it before going to grab a clean bandage to wrap around the wound. The blood would drip on Austin's own hand accidentally, which he didn't even seem to notice. And before he went off to get a clean cloth, he gave the old one to Pachelk to hold temporarily, of which the tiniest bit of blood from that got onto Pachelk. After they dispose of the old cloth, Pachelk goes to shake hands with the reporter, who then goes off with his notes. Little did they all know, they were spreading a primordial disease completely unknown to man. And this disease would continue to spread as all of the men in the museum, Locke, Austin, Pachelk, and the reporter, began to grow sick. But of course, they don't think much of it and continue to interact with people. Locke had to go across state to visit his brother, the reporter was given a new assignment to work on and was sent to a different place. Austin and Pachelk continue running the exhibit, with hundreds upon thousands of people visiting every day to look at the dinosaurs and are well within the vicinity of the sick men. It's not long before all of the men die, with black sores on their faces and their fingernails falling off of their fingers, indicating that's how the small theropod dinosaur lost its claw from being infected by this disease. The disease continues to spread in the modern world, with no one ever finding out about its origins, as Locke never got a chance to tell anyone about the dinosaur claw and flesh. The story ends with a sort of epilogue that explains that eons would pass after this event, which eventually spawned a new race of intelligent beings to fill the niche of humans. This new race discovered the remnants of a distant past, one that once carried a whole era of intelligent life that were once humans, but were now extinct. They suspected it was a meteor that killed them, and due to the severity of the event, they called this point in time the period of the greatest dying. Overall, a pretty good story, a really nice twist on the whole topic of dinosaur extinctions. I really like stories that intertwine real-world ideas with science fiction, as there have been studies in the past that have explored dinosaurs and diseases. Though I don't know for sure if there's any actual merit to a plague causing a mass extinction in regards to the dinosaurs, but the idea is interesting nonetheless, and this story took a rather disturbing turn with it. It's funny because the whole book was published in 1993, same year as Jurassic Park, which sees extracting dinosaur DNA as having such high potential in bringing the dinosaurs themselves back to life, which people seem to be more than okay with without thinking of any other possible consequences or factors as to why it may be a bad thing to do. And this story felt like a disturbing satire to that idea. Again, a pretty good read. The Feynman Saltation. The Feynman Saltation was written by Charles Sheffield, an English mathematician, physicist, and science fiction writer, who's written plenty of stories in his time. However, when he was sent a letter by Robert Silverberg, who asked him if he had a dinosaur story for him to publish for a book that he was working on, which was called The Ultimate Dinosaur, Sheffield said yes, but in reality, he didn't because at the time, he was more focused on his readings about parasitic diseases and cancer treatment. Why he was researching this stuff I don't really know, but writing for him took a backseat at this point because of it. That is, until he received this letter by Silverberg. After he wrote back telling him yes, he did have a dinosaur story for him and even gave him the title of The Feynman Saltation, he got to work on his story, but because of his research on cancer treatments at the time, his short story would be less about dinosaurs and more about cancer because of it. But the dinosaurs still play an interesting role in the story. This is what resulted. The story begins with artist Colin Trantham at the doctor's office. He's waiting to see Dr. James Wollaston, a neurologist who's called Colin in to reveal some test results to him. Bad news, the tests show that Colin has a tumor on his left occipital lobe, but the good news is that it's completely operable. Of course, even if the operation was textbook, there's the chances of the illness coming back, especially since it's malignant, meaning it's cancerous, but one step at a time. First things first was to get the surgery to get the tumor out of him. After Colin gets all of this information, he goes home, where shortly after, his sister, Julia Trantham, shows up. She's a paleontologist who took time off of work to stay with and support her younger brother through his tough time. But despite everything, Colin and Julia manage to keep things tame using their brother-sister banter. But reality soon sets in when they both have to go to the hospital for Colin's operation. She waits all day in the waiting room until Wollaston comes out to tell her that the operation was successful, and that there were no complications. However, there was something the doctor wanted to talk to Julia about regarding her brother. The kind of tumor that Colin had is called glioblastoma, which is malignant and making something like radiation therapy very difficult. So as an alternative, Wollaston has a different plan for what Colin could do as a form of treatment. There's an experimental medical procedure that's being tested for people in Colin's state, where a drug release device would be implanted within the brain with a new type of drug that could fight against the cancer cells. Only thing is, the device is not FDA approved due to it being very new. And if they were to get this operation, it would be overseas in Europe, where he could go get the operation, then come back right after. Wollaston wanted to go over the idea with Julia to better gauge how Colin might react to it. But Julia is certain that Colin doesn't care about the risks and would be willing to do it. Turns out she was right. Colin would go to Europe, get the experimental chip implanted in his brain, and go back home to the States easy as that. But Wollaston has Colin document his dreams to try and detect any side effects of the device. From here, things unsurprisingly begin to get a little weird with Colin. His dreams seem normal at first, describing him to be on the shore, watching the sea, feeling the wind, seeing the fish swimming about. He accompanies some of these dreams with drawings that include different organisms like shellfish, crabs, worms, and birds. But a couple of the drawings were off, as they were not detailed enough. They almost came off as cartoony. This was uncharacteristic of Colin, who drew and painted things to the last detail and typically only based on what he sees rather than using his imagination. But it's explained that dreams can be as real as life itself. Colin ends up making a lot of these paintings based on his dreams, but one day when Julia goes into his studio to see him painting, she can't help but notice how gaunt he looks, as if he hadn't eaten in weeks. Despite this, he stands over his canvas painting furiously with a big grin on his face. When Julia is finally able to get his attention, he says to her, "I'm through one barrier. It's wonderful, but now there's another. Bigger. I can't see way past it yet, like a wall. If I can just get through this one." Soon, Colin passes out, and Julia rushes him to the hospital, where it's revealed that his tumor is growing back, and growing back fast. As Wollaston and Julia are talking, she notices one of Colin's paintings that he had recently made that had been hung on the lobby wall. When Wollaston notices this as well, he tells her that his more recent paintings were very strange, depicting various kinds of animals that looked off to him. But when he showed Julia, she recognized these animals. They were prehistoric creatures. Julia goes off with Wollaston to gather all of Colin's other paintings, where she puts them in order of when they were made, as Colin had dated all of them. She makes a very strange discovery. All of the oldest paintings depicted now extinct animals, like the Castoroidinae, a giant prehistoric beaver from the Pleistocene, and the Hyracotherium, the precursor to modern horses from the lower Eocene. But as they progressed through the paintings, she realized that Colin was going backwards in time, as the animals depicted progressively get more and more ancient with each canvas. He even made it to the time of the dinosaurs, painting a scene straight from the late Cretaceous period, then one from the Jurassic period, and his most recent one, the one he was making before he passed out, depicted the Triassic period. Wollaston understands what Julia is trying to say, but tries to explain to her that her brother may have just listened to her when she talked about her job. Maybe he even picked up one of her books on the topic. But Julia isn't convinced. Her job bores her brother to no end. There was no way he'd ever sit down and listen to her or read any of her books on the matter because he would much rather be painting in his studio. With that in mind, and the fact that Colin was known to draw what he sees rather than using his imagination, Julia seems convinced that her brother is somehow seeing these prehistoric animals as they were millions of years ago. She's a paleontologist, so she's able to confirm that Colin's drawings on some of the organisms are spot on and immediately recognizable. Even the surroundings, with the ground and the vegetation, they look exactly like what scientists thought would grow alongside the dinosaurs. To further support her idea, Julia points out that Colin even drew organisms that even she didn't recognize from the fossil records, undiscovered creatures that only existed now in art form based on the observations of a man because their remains haven't been found yet, if they were to ever be found at all. As you'd expect though, Wollaston isn't convinced, and he sees this more as Julia spiraling out of control from the stress caused by her brother's illness these last few months. But she's determined to get to the bottom of this, and the next day, she goes and talks to Colin, who's in a very bad state. When she tells him about his dreams and paintings, he says, "Remember what Feynman said. In physics, you can look on any positron as an electron that's traveling backwards in time." But Colin sees this as a good thing, because when he's there with the animals of the long distant past, he feels fantastic. When he asks how far he had gone before he passed out, Julia tells him that he reached all the way to the Triassic and that before that, there was the Permian. That was the barrier that Colin was talking about earlier, the wall that he couldn't quite get over, but Colin is determined. That barrier, I can feel it, you know, when I'm trying to jump. I went through one when all of the dinosaurs died off. This one is bigger. I've been trying to fight my way through. I'm nearly there, but it's taking every bit of energy I have. When Julia tries to tell him that he should rest instead of jumping over imaginary walls, he responds, "You don't know the feeling. If I could jump all the way back, right to the first spark of life, I bet the intensity of life force and joy would be just about too much to stand. I'm going there, Julie, across the barrier, into the Permian, all the way back to the beginning. And I'm never coming back. Never." With that, the story ends with Colin going into a seizure and losing consciousness. As Wollaston shows up to try to help him, Julia stops him, letting her brother make his journey, even if it means losing him. So yeah, that one was a bit of a depressing one. There's a lot to unpack here. First off, pretty unique story. I will admit, my first read-through of it, I had no idea where the story was going with this concept. And while I kind of hoped there would be a bit more to the payoff other than a really depressing story of a man losing to cancer, it was definitely an interesting take on dinosaurs. It's never explained how exactly Colin was able to accomplish seeing the dinosaurs. It's only implied that the device that was implanted in his brain and the drugs that were released from it had something to do with it. But it doesn't really go beyond that, and really, a lot of the story is like that. There's a lot that's kept ambiguous and mysterious. Even with the legitimacy of the whole Colin seeing dinosaurs back in their original time thing can be debated, as Colin was losing it from the cancer and Julia was losing it from the stress of seeing her brother in this state. Personally, I think some weird science fiction tomfoolery was taking place here, and Colin was actually able to see the dinosaurs. And a part of me really likes that a lot of this was kept mysterious and unanswered. When it comes to dinosaurs in general, there's a lot of ambiguity just in themselves. So to portray a story with that same level of unknown, it feels very fitting. Also, I really like the whole meaning of the story and the name behind it, the Feynman Saltation. As Colin explained in the end there, Feynman, a physicist, explains that you can look at any positron as an electron that's traveling backwards in time. Saltationism is the idea that the evolution of an organism is occurring in large steps with abrupt changes, rather than occurring gradually as we typically hear about. When you put those two things together, you pretty much have Colin's situation. Colin is moving backwards in time in large steps, progressively making his way to the beginning of life itself. You know, at first I didn't think much of this story, but on a second read I found myself enjoying it even more. Highly recommend it. Dinosaur Dreams. Dinosaur Dreams is one of the weirdest and most out-of-pocket dinosaur short stories I've ever read. The story featured on the fall 1995 issue of On Spec, a Canadian quarterly magazine typically known for publishing science fiction and fantasy short stories. One of them was Dinosaur Dreams, written by Eric John Spiegel, that was accompanied by this weird depiction of a Tyrannosaurus Rex illustrated by Peter Francis. Immediately when you start the story, you're already greeted by weird chaos. We start in a suburban neighborhood where Roger Bennett and his wife are minding their own business inside their house one evening, when someone, or in this case something, rings their doorbell. When Roger answers it, it's revealed to be a hovering cylinder robot thing that politely states in its automated voice that it was a new weapon that was made within the confines of the Santa Clara Proving Grounds in California, but it had escaped and was going to detonate at any moment. So I kid you not, the robot wanted to go door to door in this neighborhood it had wandered into to apologize to the residents for the inconvenience of its detonation. When Roger asks the robot when it's about to blow up, it responds with, "About now," and it literally blows up in Roger's face. But as it turns out, this robot thing was a time bomb, but not a regular time bomb where it blows up after a certain countdown, but rather its purpose is to target certain threats so that the detonation of the bomb can send that threat to a different time period where they will no longer be a threat. In this case, the bomb didn't work because Roger was just collateral damage in all of this and he wasn't even sent anywhere. The blast just knocked him out unconscious, and when he's awoken by his wife, He's obviously not in the right state of mind, saying random things and wandering aimlessly around the house. Soon, government officials show up to the neighborhood and inspect the entire street. A pair of these officials by the name of Bill and Ben go over to the Bennett's house to question them about the events that had occurred. Going back to before the bomb went off, in a different point in time, there's a Tyrannosaurus Rex snacking on a dead Plateosaurus before he eventually develops a different urge. One that he is unable to satisfy properly at that moment, as there are no female Tyrannosaurs around to help him with that, if you catch my drift. So he has to figure this out on his own, which can prove to be hard when you have tiny ass arms like this poor dude right here. So to remedy this issue, he resorts to crouching down until he can reach the ground with his thing, and does a little dance until he's satisfied. How the fuck do I find these stories, man? Anyways, right as he does this, he's suddenly transferred to a different time, that being the modern age. Right as he goes to wander around, he steps on a Toyota that he's unable to release from his foot. Back at the Bennett's residence, the people that are questioning Roger and his wife Millicent end up being very weird people. Bill and Ben are very eccentric and act very nonchalant about the whole situation, brushing it off as more of a minor inconvenience rather than, you know, a bomb going off in someone's face. They also keep forgetting each other's names. They break out a laptop and a calculator, and at some point during all of this, they even seem to have found a way to track the Tyrannosaur, which I don't even know how they managed to find out there's a dinosaur on the loose in the neighborhood since they've been at the Bennett's house this entire time. But whatever, I guess. The Tyrannosaur wanders around the neighborhood, clearly upset at its current situation. He very much preferred his simple life back in the Cretaceous than his new and weird modern life where everything smelled weird to it and it was filled with nothing but commercialism. I kid you not, there's a point in the story where the T-Rex stops to look at a billboard that shows a mouse wearing a pair of Nike shoes and running out of a cat's grasp with the caption, "Go for it." But of course, the T-Rex didn't understand this. Despite that, it feels weirdly compelled to the billboard and the meaning behind it. And even though it's unable to fully understand what the sign was trying to say, the T-Rex did know that the sign was trying to emphasize that something on your feet, this material object on your feet, was a good thing, which now seems to make the T-Rex happy that it has a Toyota stuck to its foot. But then it manages to kick the car away from its foot and it wanders off with its happiness slowly diminishing. Meanwhile, Roger and Millicent at this point just kind of ignore Bill and Ben's presence, and Millicent starts to realize that they're just pawns in the government's experiments, that they have no control and can't live in peace because the government is trying hard to use them in their little projects. But Roger pretty much responds to this by saying that in their day and age, they're not supposed to talk about these things. They just have to shut up, accept it, and buy more things. Keep in mind, Roger is still not in the right state of mind, which I'm pretty sure is the point. I mean, it would make sense. The government would want us to be mindless enough to ignore whatever experiments they could be performing on us. Millicent goes inside overhearing Bill and Ben talking about the T-Rex, and I kid you not, I feel like I've said that a lot, but trust me, they end their conversation basically saying how they could train the T-Rex to only target homosexuals so that they could pass it off as God-seeking vengeance on them. But they changed the subject, and out of nowhere, the Toyota that the T-Rex kicked off of its foot earlier crashes into Millicent's living room, and she's understandably upset by this. But of course, Bill and Ben don't seem to react normally to this, looking completely past it, which at this point was the straw that broke the camel's back for Millicent. So she punched one of the men and tells them to get out of her house. But they tell her that technically it's no longer her house, because they bought it from her, which confuses her because she never sold them the house. Turns out, Bill and Ben bought out the entire neighborhood, so they're now owners of all of the houses, which I guess they were able to do according to the contract that Millicent had signed when she first bought the place. But I guess she never read it all the way through. But since they're buying it from her, the two parties tried to discuss a fair price for it. Going back to the T-Rex, he's now no longer happy at all and is actually depressed as it wanders around the neighborhood, eventually making his way to a drive-in theater where he begins to feel aroused again. So he does his little routine, and afterwards he ends up feeling very frustrated and goes crazy. The T-Rex goes on a rampage and starts destroying everything it sees, and that chaos slowly makes its way to the Bennett house, where Millicent and the pair of men are able to make a deal for them to buy every house in the neighborhood for $2 million each. The men leave, and shortly after, there's another ring from the doorbell. Roger answers it, and it's another hovering robot, which ends up blowing up again, causing everything to go back to normal. The T-Rex is happily back in its own time period, the residents of the neighborhood all received their $2 million checks, and Bill and Ben end up embracing their homosexual love affair. Nope, that's not a joke. These two guys, who were earlier talking about training a tyrannosaur to kill homosexuals to cover it as some kind of vengeance from God, come out as homosexuals themselves. I mean, good for them, I guess. Everything seems to be back to normal, except for the fact that the meteor that would wipe out the dinosaurs several million years ago didn't transfer back with the T-Rex after the second bomb went off and is heading straight for 20th century Earth. And that's where the story ends. Okay, well, that was a very weird story, but I feel like I can kinda see what it was going for. This was just a random short story within a sci-fi magazine, so it's not surprising that there isn't a whole lot of information about it on the internet. But from my own personal interpretation of the story, I read it as being a satire of human desires and how it pretty much takes over people. Like that one part where the T-Rex sees the billboard, it doesn't know what it says, but it does know it has some sort of positive meaning behind it and the product it's marketing for, and is happy because it had something close to that, only to become depressed again shortly after. That's just normal commercialism. Some advertisements try to get you to buy something you don't really need, but rather something you want, and equates that object with happiness. You buy it, find out the happiness is only temporary, but you think the way to mend this is by buying more shit. The same thing could be said about the T-Rex's libido throughout the story. Its desire to want something to satisfy it controls how it acts, and when it doesn't feel satisfied, it becomes very frustrated and out of control. It's even revealed in the story that the subliminal messages of the advertisement is just a part of the government testing the residents of the neighborhood because the residents are all just lab rats in all of this. I don't know, maybe I'm looking into this too much and maybe I'm wrong about all of this. Maybe this story has a different meaning, or maybe it's meant to just be taken literally. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below, but regardless of what the meaning behind the story is, I have to admit, it was a very fun read. Well, those were some weird dinosaur short stories. I'm starting to think reading is becoming a detriment to my health. The things I've been reading have progressively gotten weirder and weirder, and I think I've lost my mind. Please send help. All jokes aside, these stories weren't that bad, and I recommend all of them for at least a one-time read. That's pretty much all I have to say for now. Thank you all so much for watching, and please, have a nice day.